Eads, Tennessee, August 7, 1992. A 65-year-old woman vanishes from her home in broad daylight. Her car is in the garage, her bicycle untouched, her asthma inhaler left behind. That night, a chilling ransom call arrives, with no instructions, only a threat. Over the next year, a web of bizarre phone messages, fake names, and deep deception unfolds. What no one expected? The kidnapper was someone they already knew, someone dangerously close. This is the shocking story of Martha Doe Roberts, a crime that rocked a quiet town and exposed the dark side of trust. Martha Eudora Roberts was born on October 12, 1926. At the time of her disappearance in 1992, she was 65 years old. Known to her friends and family as Doe, she was a Caucasian woman living in the rural community of Eads, Tennessee, a quiet area just outside Memphis. Though not widely known beyond her local circle, Doe lived a peaceful and unassuming life, largely removed from the noise and pace of the nearby city. Her life was simple, rooted in routine, and defined by a sense of stability that made the events to come all the more shocking. Doe's health was a daily consideration. She suffered from severe asthma, a condition that required careful attention and the consistent use of an inhaler. This made even routine activities potentially dangerous without her medication close at hand. It was a detail that would later become a focal point in the investigation surrounding her disappearance. While her professional background was never publicly detailed, records later confirmed she served as the bookkeeper at her local Methodist church, a position that carried with it a level of trust and responsibility within the close-knit community. Martha was married to Alan Roberts, a man deeply embedded in her life and daily routine. The two were considered a steady couple, with a relationship that appeared to be grounded in familiarity and quiet companionship. They lived together in their home in Eads, a modest residence that reflected their lifestyle, calm, private, and unremarkable in the eyes of outsiders. The Roberts property included land that Alan occasionally negotiated to sell, a detail that would later connect directly to the day Martha vanished. The community in which Doe lived was one where people knew their neighbors and rarely locked their doors. It was not a place associated with crime, violence, or fear. The tranquility of Eads, paired with Doe's quiet demeanor, painted the picture of a woman unlikely to attract harm. Her routine was consistent. She remained close to home, and her world revolved around her house, her church, and her marriage. There were no known disputes, threats, or enemies in her life. She was not someone involved in controversial matters, nor did she lead a life that suggested danger was imminent. For all accounts, she was an ordinary woman living in an ordinary place. It is this ordinariness that casts a long shadow over what followed. When Martha Roberts disappeared, it wasn't just a woman who went missing. It was the sense of safety that surrounded her life. Her sudden absence sent a shockwave through her family, her friends, and the small town of Eads. The details of her health condition, her quiet role in the church, and her consistent lifestyle would become crucial in piecing together the mystery that unfolded. Martha Eudora Roberts was not a public figure. She did not live in the spotlight, but her life and its abrupt end would come to symbolize a deeper breach of trust and the hidden dangers that can exist even in the calmest of communities. On the morning of August 7, 1992, Alan Roberts left his home in Eads, Tennessee, shortly after 9:30 a.m. He was scheduled to meet a man who had expressed interest in purchasing a portion of their property. The man identified himself as Sam Wagner. Alan, believing the meeting to be legitimate, drove off as planned. At that time, his wife, Martha Eudora Doe Roberts, remained at home. There were no signs that anything was unusual. The couple had lived in this rural community peacefully for years, and there was no reason to suspect that this day would unfold any differently than the last. Alan had every expectation that his meeting would go smoothly. The man had reached out in regard to a land deal, and Alan was accustomed to such transactions. but the expected meeting never materialized. The man known as Sam Wagner failed to show. Alan waited, confused and growing increasingly suspicious. After spending a considerable amount of time trying to determine what had gone wrong, he eventually returned home, only to be met with a scene that felt immediately off. The garage door was wide open, unusual given their cautious habits. Inside, Doe's car remained untouched. Her bicycle, often used for short errands, was also there. What struck Alan most was the presence of his wife's asthma inhaler. It had been left behind, resting near the door. For Martha, who suffered from severe asthma, the inhaler was not optional. It was a lifeline. She never left the house without it. This small but alarming detail immediately raised red flags. Alan called out for her, but the house was quiet. There were no signs of the struggle, no broken glass, no upturned furniture. Yet something was unmistakably wrong. Doe was gone. His concern growing rapidly into fear, Alan began to contact friends and neighbors. He asked if anyone had seen or heard from Martha, but no one had. She had not stopped by any of her usual places, nor had she reached out to anyone. It was as if she had vanished in broad daylight, without a trace and without taking anything with her. In a community as close-knit as Eads, the sudden disappearance of a longtime resident did not go unnoticed. But no one had witnessed anything out of the ordinary. By that evening, the mystery deepened. As Alan tried to make sense of what was happening, the phone rang. On the line was a man whose voice was deliberately distorted. The caller spoke with a muffled tone and used an exaggerated Asian accent. The message was brief but terrifying. The man demanded $100,000 in exchange for Martha's safe return. The threat was clear. Failure to comply would result in deadly consequences. But there was no information about where to deliver the money. No location, no instructions, just the demand and then silence. Alan was overwhelmed. The sudden turn from a quiet morning to an apparent abduction was almost too much to process. His immediate instinct was to comply, to do anything necessary to protect his wife. But the vagueness of the call left him with nowhere to turn. The lack of a drop point rendered the demand impossible to fulfill. The disorienting nature of the call raised more questions than it answered. Who was the caller? Was Doe really alive? Why the strange accent? And most of all, why was there no clear next step? Alan wasted no time. Shortly after receiving the call, he contacted law enforcement. The local authorities began an investigation, treating the case with urgency. A missing persons report was filed, and the home was examined for any signs of forced entry or struggle. But there was little to work with. The house was orderly. The car and bicycle were untouched. The inhaler remained the only piece of physical evidence indicating something was amiss. There were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, and no known suspects. Investigators interviewed neighbors, but no one reported hearing anything unusual during the day. There had been no screaming, no suspicious vehicles, and no unfamiliar faces spotted near the property. It was as though Martha had simply disappeared without a sound. The absence of any physical evidence complicated the investigation from the start. With no clear crime scene and only a single vague phone call to go on, detectives faced an uphill battle. Meanwhile, Alan waited in agony. The reality of Doe's absence set in, and the fear of what might have happened to her grew with every passing hour. He revisited the details of the day repeatedly, trying to make sense of the man he was supposed to meet. Sam Wagner had contacted him about buying land. How did he find them? Why the sudden interest? And most importantly, was he even real? The use of a fake identity to arrange a meeting now looked like a carefully orchestrated distraction. Investigators began to theorize that the entire setup had been designed to get Alan out of the house, creating an opportunity for someone to enter undetected and abduct Doe. If so, it was a plan executed with precision. No signs of entry, no struggle, no witnesses. The inhaler remained the most haunting detail. To those familiar with Martha's condition, the idea that she would voluntarily leave home without it was unthinkable. It served as a quiet but powerful indicator that her departure had not been voluntary. It confirmed without a doubt that something had gone terribly wrong. The events of August 7, 1992, marked the beginning of a chilling case that would stretch on for months. The day began with a simple business errand, but ended with a life-changing mystery. The open garage door, the untouched bicycle, and the unanswered phone call left Alan and the community of Eads with more questions than answers. It would take time before the pieces began to fit together. But on that day, all anyone knew for certain was that Martha Doe Roberts was gone, and someone out there knew why. Following the initial ransom call received on the evening of August 7, 1992, the days that followed brought no further communication. The tension remained high, but silence replaced the threatening voice on the other end of the line. The vacuum of information left Alan Roberts, his family, and investigators paralyzed, unsure if Martha was alive, and if so, where she might be held. The only thing that remained was the memory of a muffled voice demanding money with no clear method of resolution. As weeks passed, the silence was finally broken, not by a police breakthrough, but by another phone call. This time, the recipient wasn't Alan. A close friend of Martha's received a chilling message that echoed the first, a man with the same distorted tone and exaggerated Asian accent, demanding money. The demand was similar in tone, but not in detail. The amount had increased, and now the caller had begun involving more people. The ransom was no longer just a transaction between Alan and the unknown caller. It had become a campaign of fear extended to the people closest to Doe. In the months following her disappearance, multiple friends and family members began receiving calls. Each one carried the same unnerving characteristics. The voice was heavily muffled, masked with an exaggerated foreign accent that sounded deliberate. The amounts demanded fluctuated. Where the initial call had asked for $100,000, newer calls began requesting up to $185,000. With each increase, the kidnapper's tone seemed more confident, more in control, and more erratic. What changed the dynamic entirely were the calls that included Martha's voice. In some cases, the kidnapper instructed the recipient to ask a specific question, something only Doe would know. The voice responding on the line, often quiet and strained, gave accurate answers. This led investigators and family members to believe she was still alive and being held against her will. The precision with which the questions were answered erased any doubt that the voice was hers. These moments, though terrifying, gave a glimmer of hope. They suggested that time had not yet run out, but the hope was always accompanied by confusion. The kidnapper's behavior was not consistent. He would call one person and not another. He would increase the ransom amount without reason. He would promise to call back and then vanish again for weeks. The unpredictability was intentional. It was psychological warfare. The family found themselves living in a constant state of emotional whiplash. They were being dragged between terror and optimism with no way to intervene or predict the next move. As the months wore on, the content of the calls became more disturbing. The kidnapper introduced a new and deeply personal accusation. He claimed that Alan Roberts himself had hired him to kidnap Martha, but had failed to pay the agreed amount. The implication was as cruel as it was bewildering. Not only did it suggest betrayal, but it turned suspicion inward. Alan, who had spent every moment since August 7th in fear for his wife's life, was now being named as the architect of her disappearance. Alan adamantly denied the accusation. He publicly and privately maintained his innocence and expressed outrage at the claim. There was no evidence to support such a theory, and those who knew him did not believe it. Yet the damage was done. The introduction of this narrative cast a shadow over Alan's role, forcing even investigators to reevaluate timelines and testimonies. The kidnapper had succeeded in creating distrust where there had been unity. Law enforcement faced increasing difficulty in tracking the calls. The technology of the early 1990s did not make it easy to trace incoming calls with precision, especially when the caller used voice distortion and took measures to hide his identity. The sporadic nature of the communication made it harder still. There was no pattern to predict, no rhythm to analyze. Investigators were left waiting for each call, hoping it might bring something new, some clue that could help identify the caller or confirm Martha's condition. The Roberts family and their circle lived under a cloud of uncertainty. Every ring of the phone brought the possibility of relief or despair. Each message seemed designed to destabilize, not just to demand money. The kidnapper was controlling the emotional temperature of the household from a distance, using voice and ambiguity as his tools. The torment was relentless, and the emotional cost incalculable. Despite the overwhelming stress, Alan remained committed to finding his wife. He complied with the instructions as far as he could, even without a specific drop location. He prepared the money and waited for follow-up calls that never came. He continued speaking to police, the media, and friends, sharing whatever he learned in hopes that someone, somewhere, would recognize the voice or pattern. He made public appeals, including a direct plea to the kidnapper, stating he was willing to do whatever it took to bring Martha home. But the calls kept coming, erratic, unpredictable, and manipulative. The caller would speak in riddles, then disappear. He would make threats, then contradict himself. He would involve a new recipient, then fall silent again. It became clear to investigators that this was more than a ransom operation. It was a campaign of psychological control, orchestrated by someone who not only wanted money, but power, secrecy, and confusion. The pressure on law enforcement grew with each month that passed without a resolution. The calls continued into early 1993, but they yielded no actionable evidence. Each voice message only further confirmed that the caller was carefully masking his identity. There were no slips, no background noise, no identifiable traits. The only constant was the distortion and the faked accent, both of which seemed exaggerated to the point of caricature. It was a performance meant to mislead and intimidate. By the start of the new year, the investigation had reached a frustrating standstill. Martha had now been missing for months. Friends and relatives had heard her voice, and the ransom demands had reached $185,000. Alan remained under pressure, not just from the weight of uncertainty, but also from the suspicion planted by the caller's accusation. The emotional landscape was marked by fatigue, fear, and a gnawing sense of helplessness. What remained consistent throughout this period was the absence of closure. Despite the number of calls, despite Martha's occasional voice, and despite the high-dollar demands, there had been no forward movement, no drop-offs, no confirmed sightings, no instructions that could be followed. Kidnapper had chosen to remain in the shadows, leaving a trail of emotional wreckage in his wake. This prolonged chapter in the case illustrated the devastating power of uncertainty. The Roberts family and their close circle were held captive, not by physical restraints, but by unanswered questions and unrelenting fear. The ransom calls, rather than offering a path to resolution, became the means of extending the pain. In the absence of Martha's presence, the voice on the phone became the only connection they had, and it was a connection rooted in manipulation and cruelty. In March 1993, nearly 7 months after Martha Doe Roberts vanished from her home in Eads, Tennessee, the case took another strange and deeply unsettling turn. The kidnapper, who had remained intermittently silent and then erratic in communication, reached out not to the family, not to the police, but to a local television news station. The decision to contact the media marked a dramatic shift in his tactics. It was no longer a private torment, but a public provocation. This time, The caller made a statement that immediately captured the attention of investigators and loved ones alike. The voice on the line, still muffled, still using the same distorted accent, declared that Martha was dead. The announcement was blunt and final. There were no details offered, no explanation of how she had died. No mention of where her body could be found. It was a chilling call, delivered not for negotiation, but as a definitive statement. For the Roberts family, the shock was profound. They had clung to hope for months, especially after previous calls had included Martha's voice. Now, that hope was being stripped away by a single anonymous voice on the telephone. But the very next day, the same news station received another call. It was the same voice. The message, however, was entirely different. The caller now claimed that Martha was alive. The contradiction was as confusing as it was cruel. Within the span of 24 hours, the family was forced to grapple with two polar opposites. First the grief of death, then the fragile hope of life. The lack of consistency didn't just frustrate investigators. It inflicted fresh emotional trauma on those closest to the victim. The police treated both calls with urgency but caution. They had long understood that the man behind the voice was not only manipulative, but also deliberate in his chaos. Every message had been calculated to confuse, distract, and destabilize. These new calls fit that pattern. The shifting claims mirrored the earlier months of ransom demands and false leads. Now, the target had shifted from the family to the public. By reaching out to the news media, the caller had expanded his audience and possibly his sense of power. The content of the second call contained something new, a proposed exchange. The kidnapper offered to reveal Martha's location in exchange for money. He named a sum and instructed that the cash be dropped at a local shopping mall. The location was selected, the time arranged, and the instruction clear. Alan Roberts was to deliver the money alone. The request echoed earlier tactics, but this time it felt more orchestrated, more grounded in a real transaction. For investigators, it was the first concrete opportunity in months to potentially apprehend the suspect or gain physical evidence. Alan agreed to cooperate. He prepared the money, followed the instructions precisely, and arrived at the designated location. Surveillance units were deployed. Law enforcement was stationed discreetly throughout the area. It was a coordinated effort designed to secure both Alan's safety and the possibility of capturing the caller. Hours passed. The drop was made, but no one arrived. The caller, once again, failed to appear. The disappointment was immediate and devastating. The mall drop had been viewed as a breakthrough, perhaps even the final step in resolving the case. But instead, it became another cruel maneuver in the kidnapper's ongoing game. Once again, the family was left with no answers. Once again, the police were left without a lead. The location provided no clues. No surveillance footage revealed a suspect. No fingerprints were recovered. It was, in effect, a perfectly staged manipulation. The decision to involve a public news outlet in March 1993 represented a distinct evolution in the kidnapper's tactics. By that point, his earlier strategy of targeting friends and relatives through phone calls had yielded no ransom payout. By escalating the communication to a media platform, he may have been seeking wider recognition, or simply expanding the psychological reach of his control. The conflicting nature of the two calls, declaring Martha dead, then alive, underscored a pattern of deliberate confusion. It was not about information. It was about instability. Psychologically, the move to contradict himself within a day revealed a particular kind of cruelty. The family had endured months of emotional strain. To then be subjected to this whiplash of conflicting statements was not only insensitive, it was calculated. Each call reopened wounds. Each lie cast new doubt. And with every failed lead, the distance between Martha and her family widened further. law enforcement found themselves increasingly frustrated. The mall drop had been an opportunity to turn the tables, to force the anonymous caller into a visible space. The fact that he failed to show up confirmed their suspicion. He never intended to complete the exchange. It had always been about the performance, not the payment. Every detail had been designed to deceive, from the promise of closure to the illusion of control. For Alan Roberts, the failed drop was another crushing moment. He had remained consistent in his willingness to do anything to bring his wife home. He had answered every call, followed every instruction, and cooperated fully with authorities. And yet, at every turn, the person behind the phone remained one step ahead, always shifting, always escaping, always changing the rules. Investigators were left to analyze what they could. The phone number used to call the TV station offered no trail. The voice, as always, was distorted. No useful audio forensics could identify the speaker. The mall had yielded nothing. No suspicious activity, no sighting of a suspect, no physical evidence. Once again, the trail had gone cold. But the March 1993 calls were not without consequence. They reaffirmed that the person behind Martha's disappearance was still active. They confirmed he was still interested in control, still engaged with the case, and still capable of manipulation. The failed drop didn't just close a chapter. It added a new one, marked by public interference and deepened psychological torment. Ultimately, the calls to the news station extended the narrative of deceit that had defined the case from the beginning. The voice on the phone had changed its message, its audience, and its methods. But the result was the same: more questions, more pain, and more shadows cast over the truth. For the Roberts family and the investigators, the sense of helplessness had never been stronger. Martha was still missing. The kidnapper was still free, and the answers remained just out of reach. By the summer of 1993, nearly a year had passed since Martha Doe Roberts vanished from her home in Eads, Tennessee. The ransom calls had grown colder, and the investigation had stalled. Public leads had produced no results, and despite months of emotional turmoil, no one had been arrested. But a critical turning point was about to emerge, not through formal police work, but through the initiative of two of Martha's own family members. Her nephews, driven by frustration and instinct, took a step that would ultimately change the trajectory of the entire case. The two nephews had followed the investigation closely. They had listened to the calls, tracked the failed money drop, and endured the painful contradictions presented by the anonymous voice. But something wasn't sitting right. Their suspicion began to focus on someone within the family circle. Someone they knew, someone who had been close to both Alan and Martha. That person was Charles Jackson Lord Jr., a neighbor and longtime business associate of the Roberts. Lord was well known in the community. He was respected by many and had personal and professional ties to numerous local families. But the nephews noticed inconsistencies. Lord had shown an unusual amount of interest in the investigation. He asked questions that felt probing, not sympathetic. His presence during key discussions had raised eyebrows, and the nephews began to suspect that his interest was more than just concern. They quietly agreed to test their theory. The plan was simple but precise. They would give Lord access to a phone number that was completely private, one that had never been used publicly, never listed, and never shared with anyone outside the immediate family. The logic was straightforward. If that number received a ransom call, it could not be coincidence. Only someone with knowledge of the number, someone connected to the family, someone posing as the kidnapper, could possibly use it. They gave Lord the number in a casual context, not letting on that it was a trap. Then they waited. The phone rang. It was the same muffled voice, the same exaggerated accent, the same manipulative tone that had haunted them for months. Their suspicions were confirmed. The kidnapper had just revealed himself, and he had no idea that the family was now ahead of him. Now armed with the knowledge that Lord was behind the voice, the nephews moved to confront him. But they did so strategically. They arranged a meeting, pretending to comply with the ransom demand. The location was a motel, neutral and quiet. The story was that they were ready to deliver the money in exchange for Martha's safe return. Lord agreed. He showed up at the agreed time and place, completely unaware that he was walking into a carefully constructed trap. During the meeting, Lord tried to maintain his role. He presented himself as a concerned third party, claiming that he was only acting as a go-between for the actual kidnapper. But under pressure, his story began to unravel. He let details slip, details that had never been made public, and that only the person behind the phone could have known. Then came a mistake that sealed his fate. Lord made a reference to one of the nephew's mothers being involved in the exchange. But this detail had only ever been shared between the kidnapper and the family. It was never mentioned outside the ransom calls. The connection was now undeniable. Realizing he had exposed himself, Lord attempted to leave. The confrontation became tense. He made excuses, deflected, and finally fled the scene. The nephews, now convinced beyond any doubt, immediately contacted the FBI. They relayed every detail of the setup, the phone call to the private number, the motel meeting, and the incriminating statements Lord had made. The evidence wasn't just circumstantial. It was specific, controlled, and deeply implicating. For the investigators, the information provided a breakthrough. Lord, previously just a neighbor and associate, was now the primary suspect in Martha's disappearance. Until this point, there had been no concrete suspect. The calls had come from nowhere. The demands had no consistent follow-through. Now, for the first time, law enforcement had a name, a motive, and a series of documented connections that aligned with the timeline of the crime. The actions taken by Martha's nephews shifted the case from passive investigation to active pursuit. Their decision to run their own test, to bait the suspect without alerting him, demonstrated remarkable resolve. It was an act born of desperation, but carried out with careful strategy. And it worked. Their plan pierced through nearly a year of silence, manipulation, and misdirection. The confrontation at the motel didn't end in an arrest, but it exposed the cracks in Lord's performance. His panic, his rushed departure, and his knowledge of details never made public confirmed what law enforcement would later validate. Charles Jackson Lord Jr. was the man behind the calls, the lies, and the disappearance. From that point forward, investigators began building a case focused entirely on Lord. They retraced his steps, reviewed his financial records, and re-examined every detail of his interactions with the Roberts family. It became clear that the breakthrough provided by the nephews was not just circumstantial, it was foundational. Their trap had turned a shadowy figure into a suspect. It had taken the investigation out of a loop of unanswered calls and given it a new direction. This chapter of the case remains one of its most defining moments. It showed the power of intuition and the importance of family in the pursuit of justice. When formal channels had stalled and traditional investigative methods had failed, it was the courage and determination of two relatives that provided the first clear path forward. They did not wait for permission. They created their own opportunity, and in doing so, they changed everything. At the time of Martha Doe Roberts' disappearance, Charles Jackson Lord Jr. was 59 years old. He lived in the same community as the Roberts, Eads, Tennessee, and was known to most as a neighbor, a local businessman, and a man active in the affairs of his church. To the outside world, Lord appeared to be a trusted figure, involved in day-to-day life with familiarity and ease. His connection to the Roberts was personal and professional. He had a long-standing business relationship with Alan Roberts and was, at least on the surface, part of the couple's extended social and professional circle. But beneath that image was a very different reality. By the summer of 1993, Lord was under intense financial stress. He was heavily in debt, his finances unstable, and his reputation quietly deteriorating. It was during this time that a discovery came to light. Charles Lord had embezzled $14,000 from the local Methodist church, where Martha served as the bookkeeper. The theft was not public knowledge at first, but it was a serious breach of trust. It also positioned Lord in direct danger of exposure, especially by someone like Martha, who would have had access to financial records. This singular fact shifted the lens through which his actions would be viewed. The embezzlement established a clear motive: self-preservation. If Martha uncovered the theft, it could not only ruin Lord's reputation, but also lead to criminal charges. The proximity of his crime to Martha's professional responsibilities meant the threat she posed was immediate. She didn't have to be a whistleblower. Her access alone made her dangerous to him. That danger gave Lord motive. His relationship with the Roberts gave him opportunity. He was familiar with their routines. He knew their habits, their schedules, and the layout of their home. He was close enough to understand the nuances of their lives, and more importantly, to exploit them. It was from this vantage point that Lord launched the plan that would ultimately lead to Martha's abduction and murder. To initiate his plan, Charles Lord adopted a false identity. He contacted Alan Roberts under the name Sam Wagner, posing as an interested buyer looking to purchase land. This call served one purpose: to get Alan out of the house. It was a calculated move. With Alan away, Lord would have direct access to Martha, unguarded and alone. The strategy was simple but effective, exploiting trust, routine, and familiarity. Alan left that morning believing he was going to meet a legitimate buyer. There was no reason to question the call. Property sales were part of his life, and he had no reason to suspect deception. That was the genius of Lord's manipulation. He didn't need to break in. He didn't need to force entry. He needed only to create an opening, and he did. Lord's plan hinged on deception at every level. He had cultivated the image of a trustworthy community figure, someone above suspicion. Even as the investigation unfolded, he positioned himself as a concerned neighbor. He asked questions, stayed informed, and maintained a facade of support. But all the while, he was listening, watching, and adapting, carefully staying close to the center of the storm without getting pulled in. His choice to use a distorted voice and an exaggerated accent in the ransom calls further demonstrates the lengths to which he went to hide his identity. It wasn't just about asking for money. It was about creating confusion, misdirection, and psychological control. Lord had the knowledge, access, and motive, and he used all of them to construct a narrative that concealed his role while maximizing the family's suffering. But as the noose tightened around him, the cracks began to show. The trap set by Martha's nephews, a private phone number only known to them, exposed Lord as the caller. Once confronted, he revealed information that only the true kidnapper could know. His attempts to control the narrative collapsed in real time, and what remained was a portrait of a man who had used his proximity and familiarity to commit an unthinkable betrayal. Charles Jackson Lord Jr. was not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was not a drifter or an outsider. He was a neighbor, a colleague, a man invited into the lives of the Roberts and trusted within their community. That trust became the foundation upon which he built his deception. The embezzlement from the church was the spark, the fear of exposure was the fuel, and the carefully executed plan to remove Martha Roberts was the devastating outcome. In the end, Lord's background didn't just explain the crime, it made it possible. His role in the community, his financial collapse, and his closeness to the victim all aligned to form a motive strong enough to justify, in his mind, an irreversible act. It was a betrayal not just of trust, but of every relationship he had cultivated over the years. When the truth came to light, it shattered the illusion he had so carefully maintained, and revealed the calculated predator behind the mask of a friend. After Martha Doe Roberts had been missing for nearly a year, and following the failed ransom drop and the private phone number trap set by her nephews, the FBI brought Charles Jackson Lord Jr. in for questioning. He had already revealed too much during his confrontation with the family, and the circumstantial evidence was rapidly mounting. When pressed by investigators, Lord eventually broke. What followed was a confession that unraveled the entire mystery, one that confirmed the darkest fears of the Roberts family and the small community of Eads, Tennessee. Lord admitted that he had made the initial phone call to Alan Roberts under the alias Sam Wagner. He explained that the purpose of the call was to lure Alan away from the house under the false pretense of a land deal. By posing as a buyer interested in property, Lorne ensured Alan would be gone long enough for him to execute the next phase of his plan. This calculated deception created the window of opportunity he needed. Once Alan had left the home that morning, Lord made his way to the Roberts residence. He entered without force, likely using his familiarity with the couple and their routines to his advantage. Inside, he encountered Martha alone. She had no reason to suspect danger. Lord was someone she knew. There was no reported struggle. He abducted her and transported her to an apartment located above his garage, just steps away from the main house he shared with his wife. It was in this small, secluded space that he committed the crime. Inside the apartment, Charles Lord raped Martha Roberts. He then suffocated her. The act took place while his own wife was present in the house below, entirely unaware of the horror unfolding just overhead. The detail that he carried out these actions within his own property while his spouse slept nearby underscored both his calculated risk and complete disregard for the people closest to him. Lord provided no justification for the killing beyond his own panic and fear of being exposed for the financial crime he had committed. Initially, Lord told investigators that he had disposed of Martha's body by dumping it into a nearby river. This false lead prompted a search of surrounding waterways, which yielded nothing. It was a delaying tactic meant to further confuse investigators and perhaps buy him time or sympathy. But the lie didn't hold. Under continued pressure and facing mounting evidence, Lord later admitted that he had not disposed of the body in a river. Instead, he had hidden her remains in a far more calculated and concealed location, his own backyard. Lord confessed to burying Martha's body beneath a compost heap behind his house. To prevent detection and mask the smell of decomposition, he had used a layer of cement and lime. This method of concealment, while crude, proved effective for nearly a year. The lime slowed the breakdown of tissue, and the cement created a barrier that blocked both scent and visibility. For months, the body had been hidden in plain sight, preserved beneath layers of common materials. Once Lord agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he led investigators to the burial site. There, under the compost pile, forensic teams uncovered Martha's remains. The discovery marked the end of the search and confirmed the truth of what had happened. The medical examiner's findings aligned with Lord's confession, supporting the account of suffocation. There was no evidence that she had ever left the property alive. The simplicity of the hiding place stood in stark contrast to the complexity of the months-long investigation. While law enforcement had pursued countless leads, responded to ransom calls, and tracked dead ends, the victim had been concealed in the killer's own yard. The quiet lot in Eads, Tennessee, once considered just another home, was now the final resting place of a woman, betrayed by someone she knew and likely trusted. The confession dismantled the constructed reality Lord had maintained for nearly a year. Every call, every lie, every manipulative twist he had employed was now exposed as part of a cover for a brutal, senseless killing. The fake voice, the distorted accent, the false ransom demands, all had served to buy time, to divert attention, and to maintain control over a narrative that masked his guilt. In the end, the truth was far more straightforward than the elaborate schemes he had crafted. A man in debt, fearing exposure, had silenced the one person who might have uncovered the truth about his embezzlement. Lord's confession didn't just bring closure to the family, it clarified every phase of the case. The fake identity of Sam Wagner, the absence of forced entry, the lack of physical evidence at the scene, and the erratic phone calls now made sense within the framework of his plan. It had all been designed to disorient, mislead, and stall. But when confronted with facts he couldn't deny, Lord folded. The emotional impact of the confession on the Roberts family was immeasurable. After months of hope, fear, and torment, the reality was both a relief and a heartbreak. They finally had answers, but those answers confirmed that Martha had never had a chance. The person behind her disappearance had not been a stranger. He had not been an outsider. He had been a neighbor, a friend, a man welcomed into their lives. For investigators, the confession and subsequent body recovery closed one of the most emotionally grueling cases in their careers. It was a case marked not only by the brutality of the crime, but by the psychological manipulation that extended its reach and pain. Lord's tactics had kept the family suspended in a cycle of hope and despair for nearly a year. The truth ended that cycle, but did not erase the damage left behind. Charles Jackson Lord Jr. was charged with kidnapping and murder. He pleaded guilty, avoiding a trial by agreeing to provide the location of Martha's body in exchange for the removal of the death penalty from consideration. The court sentenced him to life in prison, the confession, the crime. And the concealment had come full circle. What began with a phone call under a false name ended with a full admission and an unmarked grave uncovered in his own backyard. The man who had once walked freely among the Roberts family was now behind bars, his voice no longer heard, his power stripped away by the truth. The investigation into the disappearance and death of Martha Doe Roberts was a complex effort that stretched over months and relied on a mix of patience, forensic evidence, psychological strategy. At its core, the case against Charles Jackson Lord Jr. was built from a careful accumulation of details, each piece reinforcing the next until the full picture emerged. Law enforcement, led by the FBI, systematically assembled a timeline, analyzed behavioral patterns, and pursued technical leads that eventually forced Lord to confess. The ransom calls provided the initial framework. These calls, featuring a muffled male voice and an exaggerated accent, had been received not only by Alan Roberts, but also by several friends and family members. Investigators preserved each recording and noted the consistency in speech distortion and vocal pattern. Although the voice was masked, the structure of the messages, the pacing, phrases used, and manipulation tactics remained consistent. This allowed the FBI to profile the caller's behavior, even if his identity remained concealed. Then came the voice of Martha Roberts. In several calls, the kidnapper allowed her to speak, providing correct answers to specific personal questions asked by loved ones. These recordings were critical. They verified that Doe was alive during part of her captivity and confirmed the call's authenticity. The emotional strain these recordings caused the family was immense, but from an evidentiary standpoint, they proved invaluable. They established a clear link between the kidnapper and the victim, an undeniable element in any criminal case. The investigative breakthrough came through the efforts of Doe's nephews. When they gave Lord a phone number that only they had access to, and it later received a ransom call, law enforcement had a new path forward. This phone line trap served as a forensic tripwire. It proved that the caller had direct access to someone inside the family circle, someone they had suspected. Once Lord contacted that number using the same distorted voice, it became a pivotal piece of evidence. The link was no longer circumstantial, it was concrete. The FBI turned its focus to Charles Lord. They obtained search warrants, reviewed his financial records, and investigated his past behavior. What they found strengthened the case. Lord had been in significant financial trouble. The embezzlement of $14,000 from the Methodist Church, where Martha served as bookkeeper, was now known. This discovery established a powerful motive. Martha's role at the church meant she could have discovered the missing funds. Lord's financial desperation and fear of exposure offered investigators a compelling narrative of intent. In parallel, agents interviewed Lord multiple times. His responses were evasive. He denied knowledge of the calls, of any involvement in Martha's disappearance, and of the ransom demands. But as evidence mounted, inconsistencies emerged in his statements. Law enforcement applied psychological pressure. They confronted him with the phone call to the private number. They presented patterns from the voice analysis, and most importantly, they began to dismantle the layers of denial he had constructed over months. Eventually, Lord confessed. That confession became the central turning point in the case. He admitted to using the name Sam Wagner to lure Alan Roberts away from the house. He admitted to kidnapping Martha and taking her to the apartment above his garage. He confessed to raping and suffocating her while his wife was asleep in the house. And he acknowledged creating false ransom calls to mislead both the family and investigators. Initially, Lord claimed he had dumped Martha's body into a river. The FBI initiated searches of nearby waterways based on this information, but those efforts turned up nothing. When pressed further, Lord changed his story. He admitted to burying Martha beneath a compost heap in his backyard. He had covered her remains with layers of cement and lime to prevent discovery. It was a chilling detail, but one that could now be verified. Agents accompanied Lord to the site. Forensic teams carefully excavated the area behind his home. Beneath the compost, exactly as described, they uncovered Martha's remains. The body was intact, preserved by the lime, and sealed in by cement. It confirmed the final piece of Lord's account and eliminated all remaining doubt. The burial site, method of concealment, and cause of death were all consistent with his confession. From an evidentiary standpoint, this discovery was irrefutable. It linked the suspect directly to the victim and proved premeditation. The use of lime and cement indicated forethought and an attempt to permanently obscure the crime. The proximity of the burial site to Lord's home demonstrated a calculated decision to keep the body close and out of public view. Law enforcement had now assembled a fully corroborated case. The recordings, the private phone number, the financial motive, the confession, and the body, all aligned to form a complete prosecutorial narrative. Charles Lord's attempt to control the investigation through deception had failed. The very tools he used to confuse, voice alteration, fake names, and misinformation became the instruments of his undoing. The FBI's role in this investigation was vital. Their ability to analyze behavioral patterns, trace phone activity, apply psychological pressure, and methodically build the case was central to achieving a resolution. They had worked closely with local law enforcement, the Roberts family, and community members, balancing patience with strategy. It was a long, difficult road, but in the end, their persistence paid off. Charles Jackson Lord Jr. was arrested, charged, and ultimately convicted. He pleaded guilty to both kidnapping and murder in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. The legal system delivered a life sentence. The case, which had once seemed unsolvable, was closed through a combination of family courage, careful evidence gathering, and law enforcement diligence. The evidence spoke for itself, layer by layer, call by call, fact by fact. What had started with a missing persons report ended with a full confession, a recovered body, and a conviction. The truth had been buried beneath lies, but the evidence, once assembled, made it impossible to ignore. With a full confession in hand, physical evidence recovered, and the motive established, the legal process moved swiftly. Charles Jackson Lord Jr. was charged with the kidnapping and murder of Martha Doe Roberts. The case did not go to trial. In exchange for his cooperation and disclosure of the body's location, Lord accepted a plea deal that spared him the death penalty. He pleaded guilty to both charges and received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Roberts family, the courtroom marked the end of a long and agonizing journey. There were no televised proceedings, no drawn-out trial. The plea ensured that Lord's guilt would be officially recognized by the court, but it also meant the family was spared the trauma of reliving the crime in public. The facts, already clear through the investigation, were entered into the record as part of Lord's admission. The judge accepted the terms, and with that, the man who had once walked freely among them was remanded to a maximum security facility. Lord began serving his sentence shortly after the plea. Over the following years, he remained in prison, with no known appeals and no further involvement in public discussion of the case. His life behind bars was unremarkable and largely unreported. He died in 2016 while still in custody. No obituary was published, and no further statements were made on his behalf. In the end, the man who caused so much pain passed away without fanfare, leaving behind only the wreckage of his actions. Alan Roberts, who had endured the unimaginable loss of his wife and the uncertainty that followed, eventually remarried. He remained in Tennessee, quietly rebuilding his life in the years after the case had closed. Alan passed away in 2005. Those who knew him remembered a man who had been profoundly affected by grief, but who faced each day with dignity. His death came more than a decade before Lord's, closing the chapter on the person who had spent the longest time fighting for answers. The legal resolution provided closure in a formal sense, but it could not erase the emotional scars left behind. The family and community that once believed themselves safe were forced to reckon with the reality that someone they trusted had exploited that trust in the worst possible way. The emotional weight of the case lingered, quietly carried by those who had lived through it. Yet despite the depth of the tragedy, justice was ultimately served. The legal system, aided by the persistence of investigators and the courage of Martha's own family, had done what it was meant to do. It had identified the guilty, exposed the truth, and secured accountability. The sentence imposed on Lord ensured that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another person. In the final analysis, the case of Martha Doe Roberts became a story not only of loss and betrayal, but also of determination and resolution. It was the persistence of family, the tireless efforts of law enforcement, and the facts of the investigation that brought the case to its close. Though Martha's life was taken, her story was not buried. It was pursued, uncovered, and honored through the pursuit of justice. At the center of the disappearance and murder of Martha Doe Roberts lies a motive as simple as it is devastating: concealment. Charles Jackson Lord Jr.'s primary objective was to prevent exposure. His embezzlement of $14,000 from the Methodist Church, where Doe served as bookkeeper, placed him at risk of being uncovered. Martha's knowledge, or even her potential access to church financial records, posed a direct threat to his secret. In Lord's mind, removing Martha wasn't an act of violence born out of impulse. It was a calculated measure to silence the person he feared would bring his deception to light. The decision to kill was deliberate, but Lord didn't stop there. What followed was a sustained campaign of deception and manipulation. He did not simply commit a crime and disappear. Instead, he inserted himself into the very center of the chaos he created. He constructed an elaborate performance to mislead law enforcement, torment the Roberts family, and maintain a sense of control. The ransom calls were not simply about money. They were a smokescreen designed to confuse, deflect, and destabilize. From the outset, Lord relied on psychological tactics. The muffled voice, exaggerated Asian accent, and contradictory messages created a pattern that was both disorienting and deliberate. His choice to use a distorted voice wasn't just to mask his identity. It served to estrange the voice from any suspect the family might imagine. The accent, unnatural and cartoonish, was chosen to project distance and unfamiliarity. It suggested a stranger, an outsider, someone foreign to their world. This misdirection allowed Lord to remain unsuspected, even as he remained physically and socially close to the family. His messages were equally deceptive. The fluctuation in ransom amounts, from $100,000 to $185,000, had no logical progression. The goal wasn't consistency or negotiation, it was uncertainty. Lord weaponized doubt. At times, he allowed Martha's voice to be heard, answering personal questions that only she could know. These brief, haunting confirmations gave the family hope, only for that hope to be yanked away through silence or conflicting statements. Later, Lord would claim she was dead, then alive, within a span of 24 hours. Each contradictory message inflicted psychological harm, eroding the family's stability and creating a cycle of hope and despair. The manipulation extended further. Involving friends and relatives beyond Alan Roberts widened the emotional net. By spreading the calls across the family, Lord diffused attention and multiplied trauma. The ransom narrative was never about collecting payment. It was about keeping control. Control of the narrative, control of the timeline, control of the emotional state of those who cared about Martha. And in doing so, Lord shifted focus away from himself. Yet, his manipulation nearly worked. For months, law enforcement remained uncertain of where the investigation should turn. The absence of clear physical evidence, the misleading phone behavior, and Lord's ability to maintain his community role shielded him from suspicion. He appeared concerned. He stayed informed. He was present but not pressing. This blend of proximity and restraint kept him from appearing on anyone's radar. The illusion he maintained of being just another concerned neighbor was nearly enough to hide the truth permanently. What changed the trajectory of the case was not a breakthrough in forensic technology, nor a sudden confession prompted by strategy. It was family. It was vigilance. Martha's nephews, frustrated by the stagnation of the case and increasingly suspicious of Lord, created a test that proved decisive. By supplying him with a private phone number shared with no one else, they engineered a moment that bypassed deception. When Lord used that number to make another ransom call, he exposed himself. The voice may have been altered, but the source could no longer be denied. The trap laid by the nephews was simple, yet it was rooted in the same principle Lord had exploited: trust. He had relied on the trust of the community to operate unnoticed. The nephews reversed this by creating a trusted channel of communication and narrowing the suspect pool to one. This act of vigilance, born not of training but of determination, forced law enforcement to re-examine Lord. From there, the case rapidly accelerated. The confession that followed confirmed everything. Lord had used his relationship with Alan and Martha to manipulate their movements. He had orchestrated a false meeting under the name Sam Wagner to lure Alan from the home. He had used his knowledge of Martha's routine to abduct her without force. He had concealed her body on his own property, under layers of lime and cement. Every detail of the crime was designed to delay discovery, to conceal motive, and to maintain the illusion of distance. When considering the scope of his manipulation, the ransom calls remained the most haunting. They were not required for the crime to succeed. By the time they began, Martha was already dead. Yet Lord continued to make them. He did not seek money. He sought psychological advantage. By controlling the family's emotions, he prolonged their suffering and extended his own influence. This was no longer a crime of concealment alone. It became a performance of power. The emotional damage caused by Lord's manipulation cannot be measured in court documents or forensic records. The calls haunted every family gathering, every unanswered phone ring, every long night spent wondering if Martha was still alive. The pain inflicted by Lord's deception was not a byproduct of the crime. It was central to it. It added a layer of cruelty that outlasted the physical violence. For those left behind, The echoes of his voice, distorted and false, persisted long after the line went dead. Ultimately, Lord failed to escape accountability. The law caught up to him, the truth surfaced, and justice was served. But the path to that outcome was not paved by chance. It required resolve. It required the courage of a grieving family, the precision of investigators, and the ability to see through a carefully crafted web of lies. In the end, it wasn't a single clue that brought Lord down. It was persistence, a refusal to accept deception as the final story. Charles Lord's motive was clear: self-preservation. But his method was manipulation. Through false promises, misleading messages, and psychological warfare, he sought to rewrite the story of what happened to Martha Roberts. But the community, once shaken, did not stay silent. The truth was recovered, not just through evidence, but through the unrelenting effort of those who refused to be misled. This case leaves behind more than a record of crime. It serves as a cautionary reminder of the damage that can be done when trust is abused. Lord was not a faceless predator. He was known, respected, and embedded in daily life. His crime was not just murder, it was betrayal. A betrayal of friendship, a betrayal of decency, a betrayal of every person who believed he was someone worth trusting. Martha Doe Roberts did not live to speak her truth. But her story was not erased. It was recovered piece by piece, from a phone call, from a suspicion, from a backyard grave. And in the end, her memory endured not because of what was taken from her, but because of what was refused to be forgotten. Her voice, once silenced, now speaks through every record, every ruling, and every reminder that justice, though delayed, was not denied.